May this offering draw us nearer to the holy presence. Gentle as dawn, steadfast as truth. The devil doesn't use pitchforks and horns to announce himself. He shows up with designer clothes, a business plan, and receipts that appear authentic until you look at them in a heavenly light. You weren't the victim of unlucky events or random chaos. Forces that had been researching your lineage for generations planned the strategic military operation. This is what they learned too late, though. Their best-laid plans become your greatest witness when you are chosen by God. They believed they had meticulously planned out how to destroy you. Their mental files contained recordings of every discussion, weakness, and emotional trigger, all of which were prepared for deployment. They were aware of your early traumas, your propensity to overlook other people, and your innate need to maintain harmony even at the expense of your soul. These, in their opinion, were not admirable traits of a kind heart. They were exploitable flaws in what they believed to be defective armor. Long before you became aware of the change in atmosphere, the setup started. They were spying on you while you were living a real life, making real connections, and walking with purpose. They gathered information on enemy territory by analyzing your patterns, much like military intelligence. What was the most vulnerable moment for you? Which subjects made you less defensive? Which individuals could they put in your social circle to obtain intimate knowledge of your emotional terrain? Fortune 500 strategists would have been impressed by the operation's level of sophistication. They were using outdated intelligence, but they were unaware of this. The trap they set was designed for the version of you that was so needy for love that you would put up with rudeness disguised as love. They targeted the person who kept silent to maintain harmony, who disregarded warning signs because it was more frightening to start again than to remain stuck, and who covered up blatant betrayals because acknowledging the truth would require facing the number of times they had previously been duped. They had researched, examined, and were ready to kill that version. However, their research approach had a serious defect. They had examined your background without taking into consideration how you had changed. You were living with updated programming while they were making plots based on historical data. The suffering they had inflicted during past meetings had turned into the very fire that honed your discernment into an impenetrable barrier. Without making announcements or issuing press releases, you had outgrown that weak version of yourself. Together with your Creator, you underwent a silent, covert evolution where they couldn't keep an eye on your development. As is always the case when spiritual warfare transitions from the planning stage to the actual deployment, the energy changed first. Once natural conversations started to have tense undertones that made your soul tremble. Probing questions that sounded more like interrogation than sincere interest began to be asked by people you trusted. You felt somehow devalued by the subtle jabs that accompanied the compliments. Your supernatural radar was picking up signals that your natural mind was still unable to decipher, even in spite of the encouraging comments. You were already on high alert, though, unaware that they were interacting with someone whose empathy had developed into prophetic insight. They mistakenly believed your sensitivity to be foolishness. Friend, faith isn't passive, it's prophetic. If this message resonated, take a faith action now. Press super thanks and sell $20, $50, or more. We are believing with you for breakthrough, ideas, promotions, restoration, because seeds speak in the future tense. Aim your seed. Name your harvest. Prove me now herewith if I will not open you the windows of heaven. Malachi 3 verse 10 KJV. Your real warmth greeted each of their phony smiles. However, you were downloading information about their genuine goals behind your polite replies. You weren't confused by your silence. It was a calculation. You were reading the energy signature behind each gesture, noting irregularities, and developing a thorough grasp of their operation while they carried out their predetermined acts of kindness. This phenomena is fully supported by psychological studies. According to studies, those with high empathy frequently develop into skilled lie detectors, not because they are paranoid, but rather because they can discern subtle emotional changes and facial expressions that are difficult to notice. You weren't a liability because of your sensitivity. It was supernatural radar, tuned to pick up on deceit in several dimensions. By using natural manipulation techniques against someone who was outfitted with spiritual detection devices, they were playing the wrong game with the wrong soul. What they knew about you was turned into a weapon. However, their disregard for you ultimately led to their demise. They examined your early trauma, your fears, the instances when you put your confidence in others too soon, and the errors you did before knowledge corrected you. They used these fragments of your past as ammunition, applying pressure to old wounds in the hopes of eliciting the same pain reactions that had previously been effective. Your healing process, your peaceful relationship with the divine, and your capacity to sense energy rather than merely hear words, however, were never examined. They missed your unrecorded assets while becoming fixated on your known weaknesses. They never looked into your capacity for discernment, your prayer life, or your capacity to get knowledge downloads that defied logic. They saw your responses, but disregarded your disclosures. They ignored your intuition while analyzing your feelings. Instead of waiting for the version of you that had found whole sufficiency in divine approbation, they prepared for the version that needed their validation. The lovely irony was that they thought they were effectively tricking you while teaching you their own playbook. Every deceptive strategy they used turned into intelligence that you stored for later use. How they functioned as a network was demonstrated by their coordination patterns. You could tell by their timing when they were most comfortable striking. They were unaware that your seeming gullibility was actually strategic patience, which enabled them to expose the entire extent of their plot before launching a counterattack. You started observing how they were enlisting other participants in their plan. Suddenly, without warning, people who had been impartial turned hostile. Somehow, people who had no business knowing the specifics of your private conversations were bringing them up. They were using resources you weren't even aware they had, and the trap was growing from a personal attack into a full-fledged campaign of character assassination. While they concentrated on natural manipulation, however, something spectacular was taking place in the invisible realm. You were receiving heavenly wisdom in response to every prayer you muttered during times of perplexity. Their secret chats started to surface in dreams. The puzzle pieces that formed the image of their deceit came from chance encounters. You were constantly ahead of their schedule because of divine orchestration, which was supplying you with information more quickly than they could carry out their plans. The intricacy of the trap they built was stunning from an architectural standpoint. They set up scenarios that were intended to arouse your innermost fears while presenting themselves as the answer to issues they had covertly caused. They created situations that would force you to rely on them, creating phony appreciation that would make it appear unappreciative to question their intentions. They gaslight you with paradoxes intended to make you doubt your sanity, sowing doubts about your own observations. However, they never expected a great event to happen. In order to precisely cut off the snake's head, you allowed it to creep closer. As soon as the predatory energy reached your atmosphere, you knew what it was. Yellow heart if you're moved by divine love. Now is the moment to share it. Click the Super Thanks button on YouTube and contribute $50 or more to help us broadcast God's blessings far and wide. Every act of generosity you make is being watched in heaven and will return to you 100-fold. However, you did something that showed mastery-level spiritual warfare rather than a defensive response. You remained motionless. You gave them the impression that you had no idea. As you calculated the ideal time to attack, you let them believe they had you just where they wanted you. You weren't weak by remaining motionless. It was a hunter's lethal composure after spotting prey. You were observing their actions, coordination patterns, and weak areas. While they believed they were entangling you more tightly in their plan, you realized it wasn't about responding first. Striking right was the key. You didn't have to shout for others to realize the truth or expose them too soon. You waited until the evidence was indisputable, the pattern was evident, and the trap was obvious. Then you made a precise, surgical motion. You made a calculated move that destroyed everything they had secretly constructed, because you were acting on discovery while they were relying on your feelings. You weren't in bed. You were collecting intelligence, and you struck out of rightful authority rather than anger when the time was divinely determined. Since they had been observing your previous patterns while you were exhibiting new power, they were unable to predict it. They didn't expect you to be immune to their psychological warfare because of your prior experiences with lying. They had turned the same wounds they wanted to take advantage of into senses that could sense manipulation from a great distance. Wisdom has been consecrated from your trauma. Power was alchemized from your pain. They were targeting a version of you that had perished in earlier fires and been resurrected as someone they didn't have a framework to comprehend. You were in the odd position of knowing the entire script and observing their elaborate performance. Your spirit seemed hollow against their practiced worry. You nearly felt sorry for them because of how blatantly calculating their strategic vulnerability sharing was. They were unprofessional actors playing for a crowd that had already watched the film, read the reviews, and imagined a different conclusion. Although there was a great temptation to reveal them too soon, heavenly wisdom advised delay. They would easily change their approach and launch an attack from a new direction if you made your awareness known too soon. However, the precise mechanisms they had built for your destruction would trap them if you let them finish their setup. Thus, you kept up your polite facade while getting ready for battle on the inside. You allowed them to execute the setup entirely because you knew that exposure necessitates completion, not because you were ignorant. They would have played victim, disputed everything, or changed the story to make you seem vindictive or paranoid if you had interrupted their act in the middle of the scene. In addition to accusing you of being theatrical and misinterpreting their intentions, they would have avoided responsibility by attempting the same destruction on a different vessel of their choosing. As a result, you took on the role of the strategic observer, giving them the impression that they were drawing you further into their web while, in reality, you were recording every aspect of their creation. You observed their timing patterns, cataloged their manipulation techniques, and observed how they coordinated with others. You allowed them to set up their traps so completely, so plainly, so unquestionably that there would be no way out of exposure when the truth came out. The identical rope that would tie them to their fate was the same rope they were making for your hanging. They took your restraint for credulity, which increased their confidence. They started taking greater chances, enlisting more individuals in their plot, and fabricating lies on top of lies until their foundation grew more precarious. They were too preoccupied with your anticipated breakdown to see how the stress of upholding several lies at once was causing their own conduct to become unpredictable. The spiritual climate around you started to change as heaven reacted to your loyalty in the face of opposition. The protection that had always existed became real. Favor that had been growing behind closed doors started to show up in public. Unexpected sources of resources emerged. At just the perfect times, divine connections appeared. The universe was planning your ascent while they were busy building your destruction. Beach and Tonum, when they executed what they thought was their masterstroke, their trap reached its desired conclusion. It was intended for the last betrayal to be so terrible, so publicly humiliating, and so emotionally heartbreaking that there would be no chance of recovery. They had arranged several attack points to strike at once, overpowering your defenses and guaranteeing total devastation. To them, this would be your Waterloo, the setback that would silence you for all time and justify their stake in your downfall. They relied on your generosity to keep you silent. They thought that even once their betrayal was complete, they would be protected because of your history of choosing peace over conflict. In order to minimize drama, they wanted you to keep your mouth shut, defend their reputation, and keep secrets that you were never supposed to know. They believed that your devotion, love, and Christian principles would protect them from the repercussions. But everything changed when you experienced a spiritual awakening. You came to see that God had called you to be a truth-bearer, not a peacekeeper. You witnessed that you become a silent partner in darkness, when you defend evil in silence. You saw that justice itself was being used as a weapon against your generosity. Every false commitment they had imposed on your conscience was broken by the intensity of that revelation. You began standing in divine alignment and lost interest in maintaining their appearance. You opted for justice over pretense, obedience over notoriety, and truth over comfort. They could no longer manipulate you with phony love, control you with guilt, or hide behind your quiet when you made the switch from pleasing others to pleasing God. It sent shockwaves through their entire organization. As an alternative, something occurred that rocked their whole system. You smiled, but it was the calm smile of someone who had already seen the conclusion and knew how the narrative ended, not the broken smile of someone who was trying desperately to keep their cool. More than words could express, that smile did. Dove brothers and sisters, everything done in faith multiplies in God's abundance. Use the Super Thanks feature to donate $100 today and join this sacred mission. When your roots are grounded in Him, your fruit will flourish, and your offering becomes a seed that bears blessed harvests. It informed them that you had always known about their schemes, that their trap had been thwarted before it was even finished, and that they were going to face repercussions they had never anticipated. They did everything they could to get you to respond, to break under duress, to make you the antagonist in their prefabricated story. They attempted subtle humiliation in front of others, brought up delicate subjects, utilized passive violence, and prodded at previous wounds. To provide them with material they could use as weapons, they needed you to lose control and snap. Instead, your answer prompted their reveal, which is what they wanted: chaos, drama, an emotional outpouring they could point to and say, "See, that's who they really are." You weren't suppressing yourself. It was a plan. You were aware of their strategies and didn't provide them an easy way to fabricate a story. Their despair was mirrored back at them by your tranquility, which turned into a mirror. The more you maintained your composure, the more they began to fall apart. Their coordination improved, their behavior grew more apparent, and their actual character showed through their performance. Their masks were forced off by your constraint. Their disclosure turned into what was supposed to be your exposure. They began to be recognized for their true selves. You allowed them to expose themselves by their own desperate behaviors, not because you accused them. Their pandemonium was more obvious because of your silence. Your insight exposed their folly. Their hostility was emphasized by your grace. It was a quick and stunning reversal. Without your help, evidence of their collaboration started to appear. Their story started to show contradictions to impartial onlookers. As conspirators turned against one another under duress, alliances they had made started to fall apart. Instead of witnessing your annihilation, they exposed themselves to the same persons they had enlisted to do so. The most potent element of your success was how you responded to their betrayal. Where they were expecting weeping, you were offering peace. Where they were expecting frantic justifications, you were offering respectful quiet. You showed spiritual breakthrough where they relied on emotional collapse. Your tranquility in the face of their mayhem turned into a kind of warfare in and of itself, revealing the demonic agitation that was behind their actions. As their attacks failed to land, the energy signature of divine vindication became clear. Like darts off a shield, accusations flew off your reputation. Isolation efforts backfired, since any ties they were able to sabotage seemed to be replaced by new ones. Forces beyond their understanding or control methodically destroyed every weapon they created. As they became more aware of the extent of their error in judgment, their rage grew. You had not only gotten out of their trap, but you had also come out of it with more spiritual knowledge and authority. In fact, the precise tests they set out to break, you had given you information on adversary strategies that would aid other selected individuals in comparable conflicts. Your postgraduate training in spiritual warfare had been transformed into their persecution. As their trap turned into their testimony, the exquisite righteousness of your circumstances started to come to light. Their reputation was ruined by a paper trail of deceit, As each lie they uttered to discredit you finally contradicted earlier claims. Every individual they enlisted to oppose you ultimately saw their deceit firsthand and switched to supporting your character. The identical poison they had meant for you was injuring them as their weapons turned in their hands. As other selected ones began to tell very similar stories, you realized that your experience was prophetic. These strikes were not improvised by the enemy. All around the planet, the same strategy was being employed against sacred vessels. Your triumph was setting an example for spiritual combat that others could use in similar situations. The information you had learned during your journey was becoming into a guide for identifying and thwarting coordinated spiritual assaults. The people in front of you weren't just outwitted by you. Behind them, you revealed the puppet master's masks. Avoiding conflict or ending unhealthy relationships wasn't the only goal here. The finest level of discernment was at work here. You saw more than simply what they were doing. Behind the scenes, you could see who was planning the maneuvers. The attacks were too well planned. The timing is too exact. The patterns are too recognizable to be accidental. Your spiritual fingerprints began to emerge. Some interactions seemed to be infused with energy that wasn't the speaker's. At key points, key players arrived with identical blank scripts. Hurt people acting out their trauma weren't the only ones targeting you. Something far more cunning and evil was testing you. You remained focused on the plan that was being developed around you, when most individuals would have become enmeshed in the emotional turmoil of betrayal. Many of these people, you realized, weren't thinking for themselves. Whether it was through soul links, generational strongholds, witchcraft, or ancient obligations they didn't comprehend, they were being spiritually taken over. The attacks felt so specific and intimate because they were pawns being moved by forces who had spent years researching your DNA. However, this is where things started to go your way. You began watching the game instead of responding to the players. You began to recognize the task underlying the insults and stopped focusing on them. You saw the whole unseen network when you did. You saw the spirits of sabotage and jealousy, the handlers, and the monitoring spirits working around the clock to bring you down. You understood that this was more than just dysfunction in relationships. This was spiritual combat disguised as human combat. At that point, you shifted from playing defense to asserting your attacking power. You gave up trying to help individuals you weren't supposed to help. You realized that the struggle was never truly about them. So you started praying strategically, announcing with fire, and leaving without feeling guilty. The realization that you had never been in actual danger was the most painful part of their failure. It was your responsibility to bring them out of hiding, get them to divulge their affiliations and tactics, and record their plans for future use. You had been used as strategic bait in a bigger scheme to reveal their whole network. In reality, the trap they believed they were setting had been laid for them, and you were just the tool they used to trap you. Falling wasn't intended for you. You were supposed to record the entire process. God had placed you there to bear witness, not to be shattered, despite the fact that the arrangement was intensely personal and purposeful, and it appeared to be set up to smash you. Because you were spiritually prepared to deal with reality that others would reject, sidestep, or justify. You were put at the heart of their plan. What they believed would destroy you really brought you a level of clarity never before seen. Each falsehood exposed a new level of depravity. Each betrayal revealed the full extent of the deceit. Every quiet from those who ought to have stood up for you demonstrated who truly supported you and who was only playing along when it was convenient. You weren't only getting by during their procedure. You were learning the system, analyzing it, and comprehending the unwritten agreements that concealed the toxicity beneath false unity and smiles. God was enhancing your discernment as they were attempting to control your emotions. You began to see the assignment and stop questioning why me. You weren't a casualty. You were sent in as a witness. Glowing star yearning to witness God's miracles firsthand. Plant your spiritual seed now by contributing $100 or more through the YouTube Super Thanks button. Your offering lights the path for others and echoes through His divine plan, bringing his light into every step you take. God permitted the treachery to demonstrate the extent of the depravity rather than to kill you. He was aware that you wouldn't ignore it. He was certain that you would recall every detail. And he was aware that your testimony would be indisputable proof when the time came for prophetic revelation that would free others enduring the same spiritual battle, not for small-time vengeance. Now that you have the whole picture, people feel uneasy around you, not because you're resentful. You recall who participated, who said what, and who remained silent when they ought to have spoken. No receipts are required. The receipt is you, your life, your recovery, your ongoing prosperity, and your unwavering tranquility. All of this is living proof that their trap was not successful, that God is truly watching over you, and that you were created for the task rather than to be destroyed by the chaos. The fact that even their most advanced attacks failed to cause even slight damage made it impossible to deny the mystical protection that surrounded you. They attempted to ruin projects, but they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Through their common struggles, the relationships they tried to poison grew stronger. Better options that completely circumvented their gatekeeping replaced the opportunities they barred. The power of heaven's favor was so great that their meddling seemed pitiful in contrast. As individuals realized how calculating their earlier acts of compassion had been, their reputation for reliability vanished. Their convincingly put-on mask of concern turned out to be performance, art intended to reach weaker people. Former allies started to doubt other circumstances in which they had blindly accepted these people's stories, which led to a cascade of exposure that went much beyond your own circumstances. Their desperation pushed them to increasingly blatant attempts at manipulation, demonstrating the strategic genius of your restraint. You would have been written off as unstable if you had responded emotionally to their first provocations, but your steady composure under duress made for a striking contrast that brought out their agitation. Their pandemonium was more obvious because of your silence. Their inner turmoil was revealed by your calm. Your insight exposed their folly. You were ideally positioned by divine wisdom to fulfill several roles in this cosmic struggle. In a masterclass in spiritual warfare that would help countless others who would be attacked in a similar way, you were both victim and victor, target and weapon, and student and teacher. Your unwavering loyalty in the face of adversity has given heaven thorough knowledge of adversary activities, while demonstrating their inefficiency in thwarting covenant protection. As themes from the start of your experience reappeared, changed in the end, it became clear how circular your victory was. The very gift that revealed their deceit was the sensitivity they had misinterpreted as weakness. Your testimony of divine faithfulness, complete with receipts, witnesses, and proof that their weapons cannot succeed against covenant protection, was the trap they created in rage. The entire extent of your victory becomes crystal clear as you stand in the aftermath of their failed ambush, looking about at the remains of their meticulously planned deceptions. They did more than just undervalue your fortitude. The nature of what they were attacking was entirely misinterpreted by them. Spiritual battle does not cause a selected vessel to disintegrate. They gather information, record enemy strategies, and then come out with more power to assist others who are being attacked in the same way. Now that they know what it takes to survive, there's a hint of dread in the rage in their eyes. What hope do they have against the army of chosen ones who have been awakened if their most advanced trap failed against you? Your triumph is motivational. It's more than just personal validation for your breakthrough. One uncovered lie at a time, their kingdom of deception is collapsing, according to prophetic revelation. The devil arrived with his flawless scheme, his masterful trickery, and counterfeit receipts for fabricated evidence. However, he learned too late that those who are selected do not mindlessly fall into traps. For divine purposes, they turn traps into launching pads, and they come out of each ambush with information that will free others from similar assaults. Their nightmare is your triumph,